Hi, welcome to today's webinar on building sustainable business through environmental and social safeguarding. This is the last session of Water and Energy for Foods Learning Series. My name is Cassie Rodriguez. I am the Donor Relations Manager for We for Food. And in today's session, I will be taking the place of Ms. Trupti Jain on behalf of Nyrita Services, one of the innovator projects that are being featured in today's session. I'm really excited to introduce you to today's moderator, PV Sundareshwar. PV is the Senior Science Policy Advisor and was the former Bureau Environmental Officer for the USAID Global Development Lab, where the innovator projects that are featured were initiated. Turning it over to you, PV, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cassie. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you all some of the lessons learned. As the title says, it's a former lab BEO, Bureau Environmental Officer for Global Development Lab, and USAID has gone through some internal transformation, and so now these programs and positions actually sit in a different unit. But it was an incredible opportunity to work with all these fantastic innovators and working with them to see and partnering with them to see how we can really make the projects more impactful by integrating environmental and social risk mitigation. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what is environmental and what do we mean by environmental and social safeguarding within the context of USAID managed projects, and what is the value of this and why do we do this? Right. Next slide, please. So as I said, we want to provide basically an understanding of why a systematic environmental and social safeguarding is necessary. Why do you need to consider these issues, right? How does USAID implement these regulations? So we call it Reg 216. So you would probably, if you're thinking of applying or if you have USAID projects, you have heard these terms interchangeably, environmental regulation or regulation 216. So we'll share quickly what an overview of the regulation, how we approach the implementation, and look at a couple of case studies, or 3 case studies, on how it was applied to some securing water for food projects. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I wanted to impress on you right from the get-go is that environmental compliance is not just a paperwork. I know I've worked, in many different countries, and have an understanding of how sometimes environmental compliance is viewed. Sometimes environmental compliance is used as just one of the hurdles that somebody needs to get through before they can get going with the project. As far as USAID is concerned, that is not the case, right? We take environmental compliance and social safeguarding pretty seriously, and hopefully, towards the end of the event, you would also realize why that it's a good idea for you all and any prospective applicant to USAID should also consider this seriously because it has real implications for your projects. So essentially, the environmental compliance procedures at USAID is a framework that assures environmental and social risks are minimized. So our job is to think about issues that generally project designers tend not to think about. And these are some of the issues are so critical, but they might be in your blind spot, right? And you can't see it. And if you don't recognize it and catch it in time, it might completely undermine the viability of your project. So in some sense, it also goes to good project design, right? And again, if you do that, then it ensures that your project maximizes the economic, social, and environmental benefits. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of background on how did we get here, right? So the U.S. government had an act called Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, which basically said that all the good work that USAID does abroad, right, and these projects must account for the impact of our programs on the environment and natural resources where we work, right? And back then in 1970s, we had a National Environmental Protection Act, the NEPA, but the NEPA tends to be more focused on domestic operations generally. And the NEPA required that U.S. government agencies have to assess the potential impact, environmental and social impacts of our actions. But as I said, NEPA was primarily applied domestically. But in early 1970s, what happened was in one of the projects that USAID had funded, which involved some use of pesticides. In Pakistan, that pesticide was kind of misused, and because of an unsafe use of the pesticide malathion, it left 5 people dead, and hundreds were poisoned. And as a result, the USAID and US government was sued for, to force the compliance of NEPA. But since NEPA was domestic, USAID formulated its Regulation 216, and as part of the court settlement in 1975, right? So, and after that, it has been implemented through various executive orders and reinforced through various executive orders by the president and managed from the Congress. So to make sure that our projects are safe, and we put in the necessary safeguards where we work. Right. So what does this tell us? This tells us that environmental compliance at USAID is not just a regulatory requirement. There are 3 parts, right? Is not a good practice, not only just a good practice, it is also a regulatory requirement and a legal requirement. Right. So when we actually stress on that implementing partners need to do certain things a certain way, you have to understand that these are the underpinnings. We want your projects to be successful, but there's a regulatory requirement that things need to be done in a certain way, and there's a legal requirement that things have to be done, and these risks mitigated. Right. Next slide, please. So what is this Regulation 216? So basically, the Environmental Compliance Regulation 216 says that the Bureau Environmental Officer is required to approve all new and supplemental activities that are funded by USAID. Since this is an assessment and evaluation based on the scope of work of the project, so any changes that bring in new components, if there's a significant expansion, or you're certainly putting more money towards it, or if you recognize certain environmental impacts that were not foreseen earlier, would have to be reviewed and approved by the Bureau Environmental Officer. And if you hear the term BEO, that's what it stands for, Bureau Environmental Officer. So at USAID, we work in over 100 countries, right? And so most of the Bureau Environmental Officers are located in the headquarters, but in the missions, we have folks called who have the responsibility as mission environmental officers, right? And so the mission environmental officers actually help and facilitate in the environmental compliance procedures, right? And but the ultimate authority to approve these documents and concur with some of these recommendations that are put forth to the Bureau Environmental Officer resides with the BEO. So regardless of the project, all USAID financed activities require an environmental review and approval of all the regulatory documents, before the obligation of funds, before the projects can be implemented. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a very quick overview of the process, right? So you would start off with some environmental consideration, and you would integrate that environmental consideration in the design process, right? And before the implementation proceeds, you're going to do a quick review of the environmental impact assessment, screening of the project to see what the potential impacts would be. And based on the map of those impacts, you come up and comply and generate some regulatory documents as stipulated in the regulation 216, right? So I'm throwing these terms out and I'll tell you what those means. Like, for example, there could be a request for categorical exclusion or the requirement to generate an initial environmental examination, which is a little bit more in depth than the initial screening that we did in the pre-implementation phase, or requirement for an environmental assessment, which is a really in-depth investigation to get to the details of the impact. And all these documents have to be approved by the mission director, approved by the BEO before obligation of funds, right? And then once the funds are obligated, the awardee or the implementing partner is required to comply with the conditions put forth in these documents. And then the implementing partner, implements the project, complies with this, and reports. And I'll show you how these roles and responsibilities change a little bit in the next slide, please. So, the regulations were formulated a few years ago, right? So it's about 40 years or so ago. But over time, the USAID programmings have, evolved. So things like securing water for food grant challenges and all weren't the norm when the regulations were formulated, right? So typically the way the activity design worked, like the project could be designed within USAID, or the project could be designed by an applicant, like in the case of securing water for food, right? And so what happens, when these projects are designed by two different, entities? So when USAID designs it, it has the benefit of applying the environmental compliance procedures and the regulation 216 and ensuring that all the documents are placed because of the technical expertise that resides within individual bureaus and teams, right? And so based on that, when USAID designs the project, it will establish the mitigation and monitoring conditions. And then it goes in and says, oh, now we have a great project and we want somebody to implement it. And so USAID would go and procure the implementation for the project. And then the awardees implement, and awardees report to USAID on how the implementation is proceeding, and USAID monitors that. But what happens is when you have applicants designing project, you're designing it outside the agency and then submit it for potential screening for request for funding, right? So then USAID does a pre-screen and provides conditional approval, and then works with the implementing partner to develop these required documents, and which often requires a lot of redesign to mitigate the identified or perceived environmental impacts. And then we monitor how the awardee actually implements it and works with them to make sure that the projects are being implemented as stipulated in the documents. Next slide, please. So there is a pre-award phase and a post-award phase in our environmental compliance. So when somebody submits a proposal to USAID, it could be either exempt from environmental compliance review, but that happens very rarely, only in cases of disaster assistance programs or emergencies or things that are extremely sensitive for US foreign policy. But when the review is conducted for a project, it could be deemed that it has very low impact. And so we would say, okay, no significant impact, so there's no further work is required, and you get a categorical exclusion. But after review, it turns out if you could have a moderate level of impact, then we generate a more in-depth analysis called initial environmental examination that puts out the conditions of what needs to be in place as part of the project. But sometimes some projects have high impact, constructions, for example, moving earth quite a bit. And so those will actually end up as positive determination. In this case, positive determination doesn't mean it's a good thing. It means that we have determined that there is a lot of environmental impacts and we need an in-depth analysis called environmental assessment to identify what those are, identify alternatives before we can even fund the project and move forward. So if you're using pesticides, there are additional requirements of creating specific reports. And once all these things are done and BEO provides the approval, that's when the award actually happens, typically, right? So we have to work with implementing partners who are small businesses and have potentially have challenges navigating through. We will show you quick examples on how we work with 3 SWIFT projects to help address this issue. Next slide, please. So we had 3 projects that we will be talking to, today. Waste ticketing, which is circular economy, that's focused on agriculture, use of gray water and black water for agricultural purposes. Bungaroo, the Narita services, which was basically on water harvesting from agricultural fields for use during dry periods, and an integrated aquaculture agriculture project led by Skyfox in Africa. So the waste ticketing and Bungaroo were in India, and Skyfox was in West Africa. Next slide, please. So very briefly, when we looked at the Narita services, initial review actually identified certain environmental challenges with them, like, there could be potential pesticides in the runoff from the water that was being collected in these underground, constructed aquifers that was later used, again, for irrigation and other purposes. So we can get into the details of these during the Q&A and panel discussion. But this project was a negative determination, so we were able to put some conditions in, approve the project, and move forward. Next slide, please. In the waste project, it was a little bit more complicated because they were going to construct a lot of these ponds, water ponds within each of the agricultural setting, which would require a lot of movement of earth, and then the challenge of how do you manage with the earth that the soil that has been excavated, right? And there were other issues, and how do you handle potential contamination when you're using and creating co-compost using human waste? So initially, we were leaning towards an environmental assessment, the positive determination. But then we had sent out our colleague to you visit the site, do a much more in-depth review, and then report back. And then we were able to amend that to negative determination with conditions and work intensively with the awardee to come up with the project implementation plan. The final example is from Skyfox. In the Skyfox, next slide, please. The Skyfox was a much more complicated project where, it was in multiple different countries, multiple clusters within a country. The initial plan was to construct these concrete structures for water and fish tanks upstream, and then use the wastewater from the fish ponds for irrigation. And so this was clearly a positive determination, because the positive determination, analysis has to be done in a site-specific manner. So we'll give you an example of how we were able to work with them to actually walk them back to a negative determination with conditions with significant impact on the project's viability. Next slide, please. So very briefly, I've already gone through the process of environmental compliance review. So in this particular case, the innovation project is shortlisted, funding, environmental compliance, and the climate risk mitigation, I'll come to that very briefly, is done. And in the case of Skyfox, an environmental assessment was required for each site, and that comes with significant time and money implications, right? You got to generate a scoping statement and come up with alternatives. And and what happened is that some of the sites would fail to meet the USAID requirements and standards. So if that happens, then then the work cannot proceed at that site. So instead of actually doing environmental compliance for each of the proposed sites, what we did was we adapted our process so that we can partner and help the project, achieve its potential. And what we did was we stopped the whole environmental impact assessment, environmental assessment requirement, went back with the implementing partner, and we completely redesigned the project. We from the ground up, and we looked at some of these created site checklist and other tools. And as a result, we were able to walk them back and give them a plan so that the next sites that when they implemented the project in did not have that many environmental impacts that could not be mitigated through conditions in the IEE. Next slide, please. Finally, what we do is we are now operating in an environment where all our projects and investments always face the risk of stresses from climate change, right? Whether it's increasing temperature or flash flooding or what have you, rising sea level, etc. So one of the things that USAID has is through an executive order that was issued a few years ago. All USAID projects have to take into account the risks posed to the viability of the project through climate. And some of these aspects are all integrated in the way we do our environmental review. So we take a holistic approach, even though it's stemming from a different requirement, we take a holistic approach and include that. So remember that this is not so much as what the impact of your project on the climate, but the primary concern is how robust your program is in the face of climate change. Next slide, please. So I will just end with quick takeaways that the whole environmental compliance process is designed to minimize the risk, increase the sustainability of your project, but these things take time. So planning early is absolutely critical. So if you're thinking about submitting a project, review USAID's environmental compliance, reach out to folks within USAID to guide you, or if you have any questions, we are here to help you think through, right? Because we have as much equity in the success of your project, especially because we are investing in your projects as it is, the interest that you have in your success. Sometimes you have to think up front about the potential money that you might have to set aside to conduct some of these assessments and investigations. But the bottom line is that the sound environmental design equals good business solution. So I'll leave you with one thought of what does success look like of this whole environmental compliance procedure for USAID. For USAID, the success is that once the USAID project is done and we are no longer attached to you in terms of our funding requirements, and we do not have any legal requirement to ask you to submit our documents, that you continue to adopt the best practices because you recognize that it's in your best interest and the best interest of your project. So with that, I'll stop here, take any questions. I know I'm went a few minutes over than what I had planned, but I think it was important to provide you with this background. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take that, and then we'll move into the panel discussion. Thank you.
Hi, PV. So for now, there's no questions, and we can move over to the panel discussion. And in the meantime, for all attendees, you can feel free to drop in your questions, and we'll answer them in the last Q&A portion of the session. Back over to you, PV. Oh, PV, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. You would think that we would have figured out when to unmute, right? After spending all your life last year. I think during the panel discussion, we'll start off with a brief introduction of the different innovators and their projects. And then I would I'll start the panel discussion with a few questions for them so that you can hear from them what the challenges were, what the opportunities were, what value did they see in integrating environmental compliance, and so on and so forth. So with that, I think we can provide a start off with a quick overview of Narita services. Tripti, do you want to summarize? Sorry, Cassie, do you want to summarize the project?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Cassie Rodriguez. I'm speaking on behalf of Ms. Trupti Jain from Narita Services. And Narita Services innovation is the Bungru. The Bungru filters, injects, and stores rainwater underground for usage in lean periods. In addition to providing food security during rainy periods and crop survival in lean periods, the Bungru can also supplement household water needs. It's made out of handmade pipes, 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter.
Great. Our next innovator who's going to be sharing the platform with us today is Rajkumar Sampat. He's with Waste Ticketing from India. Rajkumar, do you want to give a quick overview of the project?
Thanks, PV, and thanks. I would first like to thank the entire Securing Water for Food program team for the wonderful hand-holding which they've done throughout the 3 years of our Securing Water for Food program. Our program had been a partnership with a local NGO called Rural Development Organization Trust, and the Waste, which is based in Netherlands. The Securing Water for Food program was a combination of two innovations. One is the technical and the business innovation. The technical innovation was on the gray and black water recycling, the business innovation was on the sanitation and agribusiness model. It was a circular economy in sanitation model, which is a PPP model, and we are happy to say that it has impacted on the increase in production of 2,243 vegetable growers in the area, which is in Nilgiris, a hilly area, and in the 3 years of the project, about 691.65 metric tons of co-compost were produced, and also 79,958 cubic meters of grey water recycled. There was an increase in yield of 26%, which is also a very good impact which it had created on the economic front, but also on the institutional arrangements. The farmers producer companies, and then we have the green workers partnership firm who are producing the co-compost. So and it was these are the people who are now continuing, and they are the people who are ensuring sustainability of the entire innovations. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Rajkumar. Can we move on to the Skyfox project, please? We have Oliver with us. Oliver?
Yes, thanks, PV. I'm sorry, my internet here is unstable, so pardon me if I go on and off. But just to say that Skyfox Limited is a private company headquartered in Ghana, but with country offices in Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. And we proposed and implemented an integrated aquaculture and crop production project in these countries. And of course, we are motivated by the idea of using less water to produce more food. Or if you want to put it the other way around, using the same quantity of water that ideally you would have deployed into crops to produce fish and more fish and more fish, and then use that
So, Oliver? Looks like we might have lost Oliver. So while he comes back online, I think we can, in the interest of time, we can move ahead with some of these questions. Hi, Oliver. Sorry, go ahead. Are you back online?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We had lost you for a couple of minutes.
Okay. So we constructed actually
Oliver, we lost you again.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we had lost you. I can hear you now, but you went silent for a few seconds there, half a minute or a minute.
Okay, just to conclude that we were able to put under crop cultivation more than 2,000 hectares of land across these 4 countries. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I think there will be additional opportunities for you to share, details of the project and the outcomes and benefits during the Q&A session. So I think we'll start off very quickly by asking a series of questions from each of these innovators to get their thoughts on this. So I would start off with the Narita. We would follow the same pattern with Narita, then to the waste ticketing, and then to Skyfox. So my first question to you here, Tripti and Cassie, is, what was the level of your understanding of the environmental compliance when you were actually designing the project, the SWIFT project?
Thank you, PV. Narita Services had a simple understanding that the project should not be environmentally harmful. In that direction, from day one, Narita made concerted efforts like reuse of excavated soil in the same land for farm bunds, putting filtration chambers for storm water filtration, measuring of the subsoil water quality, and enabling the community to learn its implication. Narita is really grateful to the USAID team for guiding them and the process and being part of the environmental compliance, and how these can be strengthened at the field level.
Great. Thank you. I mean, I think folks have to realize that in the areas that that Narita Services is working in Gujarat, there are two. It's a double whammy. Sometimes you get torrential rains, and on a short period of time, if you have excess water on the farmland, it destroys the crop, right? But then you hit dry spells when you don't have any water and you can't grow anything. So Narita Services solution, Bungru, was a solution to actually take care of these two issues. So if you have the surplus rain, the Bungru, which they've created as artificial aquifer under storage, would drain the land and prevent the crops from being destroyed because of flooding, right, and excess water, and then use that water during the dry periods to irrigate. And our job, as I said, is to think about the blind spot, and we think about issues that sometimes project proponents don't. And so there were examples in this case, which I'm sure Narita Services will share, is about the potential for example, the runoff of pesticides when the water is actually draining agricultural field and you're storing it in an underground water. What implications does that have, and how do we address those? So when during the review, we looked at those kind of issues as well. So the same question to you, Rajkumar. So what was the level of understanding of the environmental compliance when you were designing the waste project?
Actually, the whole organization, when we are designing this project, especially in the Nilgiris, we found that the most important thing which impacted there was the climate change effect and the variations in the rainfall pattern, precipitation pattern, which resulted in heavily on the agriculture scenario there in the Nilgiris. And therefore, we were very particular on how best we could manage this pressure resource, of water, and also for the first time. That's why we have made this as an innovation, because for the first time we are really thinking of recycling of grey water and black water. Because anybody would say, why should a place which has got 1,300 millimeters of rainfall annually think of even ever recycling grey water? So it was also because of the reason that we were looking at also the harmful thing of the farmers using excess of pesticides and fertilizers, which again was said, is there not a very safe alternative for this? And there was the co-compost, which was looked at, and as the recycling of the black water. So there was a thought, but thanks to the entire team, especially your team, PV, who have from the Securing Water for Food, who had come in and said it should also be part of the project design. You see, so that is what we had really felt very happy that how do we look at not only in mitigating this climate change effect, but also looking at more environment friendly methodology in doing that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And Oliver,
Yeah.
do you want to share your thoughts? Thanks.
Yes, please. Thank you, PV. I would say that for Skyfox, our understanding of environmental compliance actually was big, until PV came in the picture, asking all the hard questions, and because initially because of the nature of the project, we knew we needed water, for instance, and so we had to go to locations where there are abundant water, and so you basically go to an area and you see water bodies and you think, oh, there's plenty of water here. But again, you never knew whether that body of water can support the capacity you want to put up in that particular site. So when we filled all the necessary forms and stuff like that, we had a positive determination. But we thought that was a good thing for us. We never knew that was going to be more hard work, for this project. But so the environmental issues, we aren't that so much of issue for us at the design and planning stage, because we knew we had to go to areas with abundant water, and ordinarily when you rely on your visual characteristics, you tend to believe that, oh, what you have here will be enough to support an infinite number of production capacity, for instance. So we are really grateful that PV, it was tough, especially in terms of starting early with our project implementation, but eventually we're happy for it, the support we got from PV and his team. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Oliver. I mean, so we heard that you all integrated the environmental and social risk management in your plans. You initiated it before the project started, and then with the help of the BEO team and the SWIFT team. So the question for you is, how has this actually impacted your project? How has it helped? In very briefly, we got a couple of other questions that we need to get through, but and then for audience questions, but very briefly, if you want to summarize the net impact of integrating this, what would it be? So Cassie, again from you, then to Sampat, and then Oliver, please.
Yeah, thanks PV. NIREDA Services has taken significant steps to integrate environmental and social risk management, especially with the help of USAID, and specifically when the environment compliance team under your leadership, PV, visited NIREDA's implementation area around 3 times over the course of the SWIFT award period. And a specific example is NIREDA designed and ran environmental campaigns on water for irrigation and how people should avoid it for drinking. They developed behavioral change communication tools in the local language, and the community understood the messages, and they had displayed message stickers on erected bungaroos at the farm site. So essentially, Narita proposed equity in accessibility water from the Bungaroo, and they started running this as a campaign in a more systemic and structured ways.
Great, great. Thank you, thank you. Rajkumar?
Actually, if you see that this integration of environment and social risk management is, see, we are always bothered about the impact on the economic side of things, right? So, but really, I think the team from USAID had looked at or helped us to look at how, when you talk about sustainability of the whole project, it's not only sustainability in terms of economic terms, but it's also as on the environmental term, how sustainable your interventions are. So that is really a very important part which has been integrated, and also more sustainability on the environmental side with the involvement of the people there, because they are the people who are going to take it forward, and therefore making our farmers' institutions understand the environmental aspect of whatever development they do, whether it's in agriculture, the use of pesticides, use of fertilizers, even digging of wells, and all that. So how they use the recycled black water or grey water. That's how it is.
Great. Great. Thanks, Rajkumar. Oliver?
Yes, for us, I think the most significant benefit actually is the fact that this tremendously actually decreased the if you like, the environmental risks that our project could have actually posed. And of course, like PV keeps emphasizing, USAID does not like their projects to be tainted with any environmental issues. And I think for us, that was a very important impact for us. Having people visit our sites, and even some mission staff within the country, when they visit, they are really happy with what they see on the ground, the way things are run. But again, it actually helped us to really, if you like, carve a niche for our brand, in the market, because people who are actually tasted our fish, for instance, say that there's something different and natural about the fish that we produce. I think that's quite impressive for us, and that has actually helped our marketing of our products.
Excellent. Thank you, Oliver. So it looks like integrating the environmental compliance helped you create a differentiated product in the market that's of higher value, and that directly affects the bottom line, right? And so these are great examples. So in the next few minutes, I think if you could just summarize, some opportunities or challenges that you faced, or you can integrate that, with some thoughts on what any future applicant who's contemplating putting a proposal to USAID should be thinking about, right? Would be great. And then if you can also have a couple of suggestions for USAID in terms of, what USAID could do better to engage, especially these small, businesses and NGOs. So very briefly, because we want to leave some time for Q&A as well. So if you can just try kind of give one example each of these, that would be great. Cassie?
Great.
Yeah.
Yes. Thanks, Judy. Yeah, from Narita's perspective, environmental compliance is a very wide area. It is quite integrated with the economic and social aspects. And Narita has expertise on social and economic process of the innovation, where they'd love to learn more on EHS and expand the knowledge horizon. And in that direction, in 2020-2021, Narita has forged a partnership with a globally acclaimed EHS company. It's an Indian company who delivers EHS services across India, and multi-donors agencies across the globe. And they're now jointly working with an HIF-funded program in West Bengal on storm water management. And Trupti, if there's anything that you'd like to add on PV's specific question, I know that perhaps you're not feeling well, but if you can feel free to add or message me if I missed anything.
Yeah, and thank you, Cassie, but at this stage, no, yes, you have covered a lot. Thank you.
Rajkumar?
Actually, from the opportunities and challenges side, more than the opportunities, challenges are plenty. When you really talk about how you integrate the whole environmental compliance into any development project, it's again related to the entire dilemma of development versus ecology and environment. But given the correct perspective of how you design the whole thing, from the word go, and how your team, PV, your team helped us to really look at the EMMR, the Environmental Mitigation Management Plan, and then the Environment Management Mitigation Report. So that gives us a clear picture of how in depth we can look at what will be the environmental consequences of our interventions, and also find out how best we can reduce them, or how best we could really tackle them in the right way. So that part of the thing was very, very interesting, and the challenges are like we were trying to, because we were partnering with even the government institutions, to also make them understand how important it is when they take up a lot of development work to look at also how environmentally sound those things are. Those have been challenges, and also trying to get our farmers also to do the thinking in the right direction to go ahead. So that has been quite a good learning experience for us. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Oliver?
Yeah, I think in terms of opportunities, there are immense branding opportunities, and of course that, like you said, that ultimately has an impact on bottom lines. And again, there's a kind of if you like, joy that you get if having to go through all these environmental risks and ensure that you are actually mitigating them or not contributing to any of those risks. So I think that it's a great opportunity to be able to show that you can actually produce in an environmentally sustainable way, and continue to make social and economic impact, within your domains. So I think that's a very big opportunity that needs to be that one can continue to harness. Now, in terms of challenges, it was actually very difficult for us having to do multiple environmental impact assessments for multiple sites. There's a whole lot of cost involved, which actually we didn't plan for. And of course, the time wasted having to go through that, because like specifically for us in Ghana, these the folks at the EPA, meet once every 3 months to consider proposals. And so if for any reason you are not able to submit within that period, then it means you have to wait for another 3 months before they could sit on your assessment and approve. So that caused a whole lot of delays for us. And we had to actually find a way, because we didn't want the project to be cancelled. So we had to find a way to, innovate our infrastructure in such a way that, its impact, the original envisaged impact, could actually be mitigated. And that was why, instead of digging ponds, we had to look for surface ponds. And that was the only way PV could graciously allow us to, to continue with our project implementation. So I think that if USAID could do something in that area, whereby probably in the initial, as part of the initial stage of the project, all these environmental things, have to be dealt with and cleared before projects can be allowed to start. I think that would be very helpful for innovators.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I know we are running short on time, but thank you for sharing your experiences. I'm going to open the floor up for any Q&A that we might have from audience or any clarifications that they need.
Hi, yeah, we have a few questions from the audience.
Sure.
Question, how did you align with the local environmental regulations, such as negative lists that may vary with the USAID Reg 216 in some cases?
So that's an excellent question, right? So the bottom line is, our goal is to protect the health and the environment of the environment and people where we work. So we have to, whatever implementation and mitigation conditions have been put in, have to align and meet the local regulatory requirements. And in cases where there is a difference between what the US requirements are versus what the local government requirements are. So generally speaking, the stricter of the two prevails, right? So whichever is more stringent prevails. But there is always due deference to the local regulatory requirements. So sometimes in case of Skyfox, I've heard Oliver and others actually tell us that the fact that the questions and the packages and the issues that we actually raised were exactly the questions being raised by EPA in Ghana, right? So what you do in terms of meeting our requirements will also help you meet the requirements of the host governments in most cases. Thank you.
Thanks, PV. And the other questions are more related to the program and We for Food. So for those questions, we will answer them separately. But we do have a few more minutes for questions related to the session. So attendees, feel free to submit your questions. PV, I'm not sure if there's any follow-up questions that you'd like to ask the innovators in the meantime, or we'd just like to hold off.
We can give a minute and see if anybody has a question. We've spoken for quite a bit now, almost an hour, and see if there are any questions that come from the audience. If not, then I would like to actually give some specific examples of how we address some, issues and the blind spots through this partnership, right? So I want people to recognize that it's a partnership. We are from the compliance side, but at the same time, we have an interest in ensuring that your projects succeed. So are there any other questions?
No more new questions for now, but I'll let you know if any questions come through.
So very quickly, so looking at an example in the Narita services, right? So the issue was that when there's water scarcity, people are very accustomed to using borewell water that is being tapped from aquifer, and they can use it for drinking, they use it for irrigation, they use it for just about everything, right? And so in this case, when you're creating this artificial aquifer, which is draining an agricultural land, which might have tons of pesticides that have been used, so the water is contaminated with pesticides, even though if it's going through some kind of a charcoal filter. So when people actually, during the summertime, when people are actually pumping that water, they in their minds, it's the same as a borewell water, which it is not, right? Because now it contains pesticide that typically a deep aquifer borewell might not contain, right? And so the aspects of actually preventing people from drinking that water or using it to, feed their cattle is very, very important, because there could be completely unforeseen consequences of that. Especially if there's a pregnant woman in the family, for example, right? So the campaign that Narita Services did about telling people, not to do it. The key here is not to just tell people that they can't do something. You got to tell them why they can't do it. Why is it in their interest? If you don't give a reason, then people don't really understand, and then the compliance drops, right? So as part of that, our job is also to not only tell implementing partners what they cannot do, but work in partnership with you to tell you how you can avoid that impact and how you can do something differently. And so not only putting these restrictions, but also coming up with solutions. Similarly, with the Narita, with these waste sticking, see, it's co-compost, right? So you're creating waste from you're creating fertilizer compost from human waste. And sometimes you have issues of things like helminth eggs, right? So these parasites. So if the composting process is not done appropriately, then you could have live eggs in that compost. And when people actually spread that fertilizer using their hands, then there's a potential for reinfection, right? And in some cases, these reinfections in extreme cases can be life-threatening. So our job is to think about these things. Our job is to think about cultural sensitivity. Some communities will be completely averse to using a fertilizer that has been generated using human waste because of their cultural sensitivities. And so if you're not appropriately labeling the bag, then you're kind of misleading the community, right? So later, for example, if they are misled and they're using it and later come to know that this is something that goes against their core cultural belief, that can completely undermine your projects. So when we start looking at this, we talk about these cultural issues as well. So I think, we need to think about these things as you're thinking about your project. Early impact and early integration of environmental compliance is absolutely critical for your success of project, because it's going to save time during the review process, right? But it's also going to save you money and make your project more viable over the long term. So with that, I'm going to stop. It's 10:01.
PV, sir, there's just one last question that came through the
Sure.
audience. Do you mind taking
Sure,
that?
sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, great. So this question is, how is water impact measured on a wider level? For example, storing water in one area, how does it impact the bigger watershed landscape / water ecosystem?
That's an excellent question. And so I guess I will have to contextualize that a little bit by giving you two examples. So in the case of Narita Services, the Bungru was actually providing a service, right, a benefit to the farmers. And so the Bungru is actually located in the lowest elevation point within a network of farms. And so the way the project was designed was also based on a collection of cohort of farmers who shared the land. And there are other novel elements of the project that are so empowering to the community, especially women in the community. So you're, by draining the water from the excess water from these farms, you're actually providing a positive benefit. And then the water is reused and shared equitably during the distribution. I'll quickly pivot to the example from Skyfox. So in one of the things that the Skyfox project, as you heard Oliver say, was they would abstract water from these resources. So the thinking about is that as we are looking at the impact, we got to think about during the input side, when you're extracting water from a particular water body, you got to make sure that it doesn't impact the integrity of the ecosystem and use downstream. So, for example, if you did this exercise during a rainy season, you're going to get plenty of water, and you would think there's plenty of water for me to be able to do my project, right? But not recognizing that because of the climate change and because of the things, there has been a decreasing trend during the summertime precipitation, and there's not going to be enough water later in the year during the summer months for you to keep your project viable, and you would drop the water level below a certain threshold, which is going to detrimentally impact the ecological integrity of the water stream as well as further use downstream. So these are the things that you got to do a water budget, right? But on the flip side, in this case, is that when Skyfox, you can only use so much water on the agricultural land, and sometimes if you have excess water, that has to be put back into the system. Now this water is enriched with waste from a fish pond, so this has to be treated in some manner before it can be discharged into the stream. So there are environmental pollution control regulations on the back end that happens. On the front end, it's about abstraction. And also the quality. So in one of the cases that Oliver can maybe chime in, what happened was some person upstream at one of the sites that they had created for pilot and demonstration, some person upstream, a farmer, actually dumped some excess pesticide that they had in the stream. And as a result, that, in their pilot setting, it basically ended up killing the fish, because they were using this water that was further downstream, but it got impacted by somebody doing something that was not desirable further upstream into the watershed. So these things are all connected. So when we look at the water resources and general assessment, we take a holistic approach. We look at the impact of the project, but we also look at the cumulative impact of the project is kind of, implemented in small pockets in multiple areas. I hope that answers the question. Oliver, if you have anything else to chime in there?
I think you just said it all, except to say that, in our attempt to mitigate that, what we did was to set up a small tank with fish, where we normally, put the water for some few days before we can now use that on our main tanks, so that if something happens to the fish, then we know there's something wrong with the water, and so we can't use it, and we have to look for alternatives. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other question? I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, no more questions, PV.
I wanted to flag for all of you that, as I said, the things have transitioned from these lab projects, and this whole portfolio now sits in a different shop. And on the last slide of the presentation, I had referenced, Teresa Bernhardt. Teresa Bernhardt is the agency's environmental coordinator, and she's also the acting BEO of the new bureau in which these projects are going to reside. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to them. I'm not sure if Teresa is online, and if she has a couple of thoughts that she might want to chime in by chat, which I think we can relate to the audience here. But you have to remember that we are partners for you, and so if you have any questions, it's going to be, you should reach out to us and ask, and we will try and be as helpful as possible. So yeah, so I'm not sure if Teresa is still there, but if not, and if there are no other questions, I think I don't have anything else to share.
Great, thank you so much, PV, for moderating today's session, and to all the innovators featured, Oliver from Skyfox, Rajkumar from Waste, and Trupti, though I was speaking on her behalf, from my Reader Services. Thank you so much all for a wonderful presentation. And to all our audience, we will be uploading the recorded version of today's webinar on our YouTube channel and our website as well in the next couple days or week. And thank you all again. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. And for regulations, you can just go to USAID environmental regulations, just do a Google search, and you will get a link to USAID regulation that you might want to look at it if you're designing any projects. So that's a final thought. Thank you.
Thank you all, specifically Cassie and PV.
Thank you. It was a pleasure working with all of you, and it's always a two-way street. So I learned a lot as well. So
thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the entire team, and thanks a lot, PV, for moderating the whole session. Thanks for giving us the opportunity to share with you our experience. Thank you.